A gościem Minęła 20 jest Douglas Murray, autor bestsellera, światowego bestsellera, książki, która jest jedną z najlepiej sprzedających się książek w amerykańskim serwisie Amazon. Książka zatytułowana jest Dziwna śmierć Europy i traktuje o europejskiej polityce migracyjnej. Mr. Douglas Murray, welcome to Poland, welcome to Minęła 20.
It's very nice to be with you.
Mr. Murray, your best-selling book on the European migration policy is titled Strange Death of Europe. Why do you find the European migration policy a deadly threat to the European continent?
I think it undermines and changes irrevocably everything about Europe. I see the 2015 crisis as just a speeding up of something that had been going on for many years. Of course, it's more pronounced in Western Europe than it is elsewhere, but it is something which threatens, I think, the whole of Europe. It threatens European values, European identity. It basically says that the rest of the world is for the rest of the world, but Europe is for anyone in the world who wants to come here as well. And I think this is a fundamental issue of our times, which is going to run on for a very long time to come.
Before we go back, because in your book there are a lot of sentences and a lot of words that are referring to the past and to the history of the European migration policy. But before we go there, the most important question that comes to my mind when we are thinking about 2015 crisis is the question of why did Angela Merkel decided to invite those migrants and this flow of migrants to Europe, knowing that it must undermine her political position not only in Germany but in the European Union as well. What is the real reason for this invitation in 2015, in your opinion?
Well, this is a very important question and perhaps a fundamental one. It is answered in my book, but I say that you can't answer it just by looking at the everyday, and you can't only answer it by looking at the profound underlying issues. It's a combination of all of these. Angela Merkel, before August 2015, had actually tried at various times to hold a fairly stern line about the illegal migration. And so what she did at the end of August 2015, when she basically opened the borders of Europe to the whole world, was in my view something which was simultaneously affected by the immediate political events that were going on around her and around Europe, and also by far deeper echoes that were going on in her mind and in the minds of Germany in particular. And that is that through a whole succession of things, she thought it was impossible for the future of Germany to say no to people at its borders. You saw, of course, we all remember the photographs of almost ecstatic German crowds welcoming the refugees and migrants as if they were a homecoming football team fresh from a great triumph. Something strange happened in the air of Germany in that period. And you have to go a very long way back to understand it, of course. But if there was one thing in particular, it was that story which we now know for sure since I wrote my book, but which I had guessed was the case already when I was writing it, that she basically felt that it was impossible for German border guards to repel migrants from the German borders. She didn't want those photographs to go around the world.
But Mr. Murray, Germany doesn't border with the countries that the wars are going on in. Germany doesn't border with Libya, Germany doesn't border with Syria, Germany doesn't border with the southern African states.
Well, of course, but Angela Merkel knew that once she had invited or was in the process of inviting people to come, they head towards Northern Europe and not to the south. They all want to move to Germany, to Scandinavia and elsewhere. People tend not to want to, for instance, stay in Italy, in my experience of on-the-ground research. But the crowd's already moving through Hungary and so on. So this had already started. But this key point is that in order to avoid what I think would have been a short-term political embarrassment, Angela Merkel helped to destroy an entire continent.
But it would suggest that this decision was a kind of emotional decision, which basically doesn't sound right to me. Germany isn't a country that decides on the basis of emotions. Those are some issues related to the interest of the German state.
You say that, but my view is that an emotion which was already riding high in Germany, particular, the emotion of trying to seek some kind of atonement from history. A lot of very deep things were going on at that point. But what we've seen since, and what I argue we saw before, was a set of arguments to justify this, which have nothing to do with the actual event.
Those justifications and your arguments on these justifications is, in my opinion, the crucial point of this book, because there are four major issues that you try to tackle. One of the most important, and you disagree with that, that the migration flow boosts the European economy. Why don't you agree with that argument?
All the studies that I've seen on this show that at the very best you could say that it brings no economic gain in the long run. Mass migration. In fact, if you look at the recent welfare figures from Germany, they are exactly what you could predict. The people who came in 2015 were not hedge funders and high net worth individuals and physicians and doctors and so on. They were in large part, people from very undereducated parts of the world. I'm particularly thinking of sub-Saharan Africa. And these people could not immediately contribute to the German economy. I mean, another example I give is that the only thing that the Swedish economy, which is the only country, of course, to take in a per capita similar number of people to Germany in recent years, it's the only thing Sweden needs less than unskilled labor is unskilled labor that doesn't speak the language. So there is,
so maybe it's a long shot, because this is another justification that Europe is aging, is getting old. So we need in Europe new wave of people so that our economy could run in 50 or 100 years on those people. What about that argument? You also do not agree with that.
Yes. There's a fundamental problem with it, isn't there? Which is the amazing fact that immigrants grow old as well. It's not just we Europeans who suffer the aging process. Everybody does.
Well, we as Europeans do not have such amount of children.
Well, that, as you know, in Poland, is something which governments can try to address. If you look at the statistics in Britain, for instance, during the period of mass migration from the late 19th onwards, most British women wanted to have a number of children that would allow a replacement level of population, in which case there are all sorts of things that a government can do to encourage people to have children, long before you decide that the next generation of Europeans should be from Eritrea, for instance. So maybe
it's a bet that the European elites took. Well, in 50 years, we are probably look different as Europeans, but at least there are going to be people in Europe.
Yes, it's for all sorts of reasons I give in detail in the book. As you know, this is a totally fallacious argument. It is a lie that is pushed to the European publics to justify a decision that the politicians had already made.
How about diversity? Another argument, another justification that is widely present in the European media.
Yes, the diversity argument is a fascinating one, because this says that we in Europe are a rather boring, staid, uncultured place, that we don't have very many interesting things about ourselves, and so we need to import people from around the world to make us more interesting. Of course, you never hear this the other way around. Nobody says that, for instance, what Africa really needs is an influx of Polish people to make it more interesting intellectually and culturally. I don't doubt, by the way, that a large influx of Polish people would have that effect. But you never hear that argument. You never hear people saying that, for instance, the Middle East needs a large number of people from Wales to bring Welsh culture to the Middle East. It's only European culture that is presented by our leaders as so bereft of interest that we need to sort of vim it up a bit. Again, like the other arguments, this is an fallacious argument to try to justify something the politicians have already wanted to do to us.
So do you find a short answer to the question, why did the politicians decide to do it to us?
My own short answer to it is massive incompetence, allied with a sense of historical guilt, a sense of historical self-negation, a sense of terrible self-dislike, and an unbelievable short-termism. I've seen all my adult life in politics this type of person, the type of politician who thinks they can willfully experiment with our collective future, who has no knowledge of the long-term effects of, for instance, large population replacement. And I think this generation of politicians who have encouraged this will be, if there is any history written in the future, will be damned by it.
Mr. Murray, in your book, also the issue of Islam right now in Europe is very important. From our perspective in Poland, it's a remarkable thing. The Europe goes away from the Christian roots, the Christianity established Europe. Still, Islam is, as a religion, is somehow shown and treated better from our perspective than Christianity right now in Europe. And it's also related to the migration policy. What is the reason of this?
There are lots of reasons. The reason that my book has a large section on Islam is because I think that what Europe is discovering at the moment across the continent is that in all of the diversity and multicultural melting pot, it's the Islam bit which we may find it impossible or at least very difficult to digest. It's the bit that is least able to be integrated into the rest. That's because if you integrate people into a very weak culture that is self-hating, guilty, and so on, all the things I've described and more, and you introduce people into that weak culture from a culture that is very self-assertive, has very strong views, not just on welfare policy or taxation, but on everything to do with life, love, the meaning of life and the meaning of death and the afterlife. If you introduce that, it's likely that there's going to be a clash. Only people so ignorant of this as the recent political class have been could not have predicted this.
Maybe it was another bet made by the European politicians that they managed somehow to make the Christianity out of Europe. Maybe they were thinking about doing exactly the same with Islam, while yes, Islam is going to be here. Looks like it doesn't work.
Yes, I agree with you. It seems that is the presumption, that we're going to make the Muslims like all the rest of us. They'll all lose their faith. They'll all just enjoy shopping and going on holiday, and it'll all be fine. I think it could all go in a very different direction, and I think that the evidence favors my pessimistic view rather than the blindly optimistic view of the political elites. But yes, currently, as a result, Islam is a more protected religion in Europe than Christianity or any other religion. And that's for some understandable reasons. The politicians think that they need to be extra nice to these incomers and give them extra leeway. But it's also for very sinister reasons, such as, again, I come back to it, the fact that if you dislike and distrust yourself as much as our leaders seem to dislike and distrust this continent of ours, then you can love almost anything so long as it's not your own.
Okay, another question and another words that we hear very often. The terrorism in Europe, the wave of terror, of Islam terror in Europe is not relied anyhow to the migration crisis. Do you agree with that?
No, I mean, people spread this lie less and less because it becomes more and more obvious that it's a lie. Just a few weeks ago, not very far from where I'm sitting in London, a young migrant from Iraq left a bomb on an underground train. We've seen multiple cases now in Germany, in France, in Scandinavia, and across the continent of people carrying out terrorist attacks who have come in the recent wave of migration. And of course they have. This isn't to say that all the migrants are terrorists, obviously not. But if you are so lax and you care so little about who you let in, of course some of those people who you let in are going to be terrorists, or are the sort of people who are going to become terrorists. So currently, this is a very important point, currently the political class has only thought that there is a gain from being open-hearted and open-bordered. And what they are going to start to realize is that there is and should be a price to pay for being so willfully lax with the security of your citizens.
Mr. Murray, you also write a lot about our region of Europe. You write about Poland, you write about Central Europe, and in your prediction, the Central Europe seems to be much more lucky in terms of this migration madness, I would call it that way. Why do you think that the prospects and the future of this region in terms of migration policy is much lighter than the old Europe?
Well, you and many of your viewers would know this far better than me, but I think there is a very obvious explanation. Firstly, that the political class in Central and Eastern Europe has been far, far more wary about all of this than the blindly optimistic and I think ignorant class of politicians that have ruled Western Europe in recent years. It's the case that political leaders in Eastern and Central Europe have been rightly careful with the security situation and therefore the immigration situation in their countries. I think there are all sorts of fascinating historical reasons for that. But I think in particular, there is a memory in your part of our continent, which is an appropriate memory, which remembers what happens, which remembers how cruel and appalling history can be, how careful you have to be with your society not to lose everything. And I think that this memory has become almost absent from Western Europe. We've lived in this strange daydream, and I fear as a result that the wake-up from that daydream will be very, very painful.
Mr. Murray, my final question then, there is a kind of paradox that, at least for me, it looks like a paradox. The European migration policy and the mandatory relocation quotas that were established in European Union in 2015 were realized only in 20%. Despite of such a small number, only a couple of countries opposed loudly this stupid policy, and those were the countries like Poland, like Hungary, like Czech Republic. But how do you explain that? Only 20% of those migrants were relocated from Greece and Italy, and only 3 countries in Europe decided to loudly say that they do not agree. Nobody agrees to that, but only 3 countries speak about it loudly. Why?
Several reasons, but one is, of course, as we know, the political bullying which has gone on of countries that have refused to obey the European Commission. By the way, the quota system from the beginning, I show this in the book, the quota system from the beginning was already inadequate for the numbers already in. So when the Commission...
And still nobody opposed.
No, well, it's extraordinary. I mean, it was obvious that the numbers the Commission was talking about countries taking in were, as they were announcing them, insufficient for the number of people already in Europe, let alone the more to come. So I think that certain governments, quite understandably, recognized that this was madness being organized by madmen and refused. Now, I was just in Hungary a couple of weeks ago again, and yes, I've seen in many countries and heard many politicians relay the political threats that are made to them for refusing to go along with this. But the people who stand against this madness will be judged well by history, and those who have fallen in for this crowd stampede, I think, will be judged very poorly by history.
Mr. Douglas Murray was a guest of Minęła 20. Douglas Murray był naszym gościem, a książka w języku polskim ukaże się niedługo. Z pewnością wzbudzi wielkie dyskusje w Polsce, dyskusje, które budzi już od wielu lat w innych częściach świata.